I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com.
So a fifth person has been convicted in connection with the plot that led to the murder of Keane Mulready-Woods. And I suppose it's a conviction that shows how widespread this feud became, because it involves a guy called Stephen Carberry, who's a well-known drug dealer originally from North Dublin. What did he plead guilty to this weekend?
So he's one of a number of men that have been now convicted in relation to kind of the aftermath of the murder of Keane Mulready-Woods in January 2020. So they've been charged with various things like facilitating a criminal gang and assisting in an offence. And in Stephen Carberry's case, he pleaded guilty last Monday to assisting an offender by helping in the movement and disposal of body parts. So that was his specific charge. Now, he was originally, there was two other charges that were brought against him, and there was a nolli prosequi that was they're dropped by the state in return for the guilty plea.
Yeah, and of course they've been charged under these anti-gangland laws where, each individual action is connected with a sort of, a broader criminal enterprise, I suppose, if you want to put it that way. Now, Stephen Carberry, at the time he committed this crime, it was only months after the death of his own brother, Richie Carberry, who was a key player really in that feud and was also a very well-known drug dealer who I suppose had sponsored one side of the Drogheda, the feuding gangs.
Richie Carberry would have been aligned to the Boylan gang. And I suppose in a way he was one of the many sort of personalities or gangland figures that were kind of in a way behind the scenes in this, what we now know is a very complex kind of feud that was going on, involving various kind of people who were hands off on the actual day-to-day drug dealing while these guys on the street fought it out.
Yeah, of course, because Richie Carberry would have come from sort of North Dublin. He would have grown up with people like Mr. Big. They would have, I suppose, been contemporaries at one stage. But Richie Carberry was a drug importer in his own right, a wholesaler. And as the business grew, he sponsored, I suppose, or he certainly helped direct the Boylan brothers, really, who've been named in court as they've been described as the Boylan organised crime gang, and they were the young Turks, I suppose, who went to war with the Maguires, who've been very well established. Now, Carberry was, although he dealt with various criminal figures across Dublin, he was, I suppose, a solo operator. And again, the murder of Keane Mulready-Woods, we know who carried it out. It's Robbie Lawler. And of course, Robbie Lawler would have a connection with the Carberries, an obvious connection.
Yeah, so I mean, well, it was Richie Carberry's wife, Eileen, is Robbie Lawler's sister.
Yeah.
And that was the connection there. So he obviously rode in on the side of his brother-in-law. So he was actually, Lawler would have been in prison at the time. He was being held on charges, which he was eventually acquitted of at that stage. And so like his brother, so Lawler got out in December, but Carberry would have been shot dead just in November. And then you had Mulready-Woods killed in January. And there's never really been a full explanation as to, why Mulready-Woods was killed. And you can only surmise that it was to send out a message and it was some kind of revenge. And this 17-year-old kid just happened to be the unlucky person who was nominated for the horrific treatment that was dished out to him.
Yeah, of course. I think it's as simple as that. I think that obviously Keane Mulready-Woods had become mixed up with all this criminality that was going on in Drogheda, but he's a 17-year-old, a child, and certainly isn't directing anything or anything of the sort. Now, people will listen to this podcast will know the basic story of Keane Mulready-Woods' murder, but obviously he was a child who was literally dismembered and chopped up, and those body parts, he wasn't chopped up so they could get away with dispose of them and hide them. It was chopped up, as you said, for intimidation purposes, and the body parts, although this the plot didn't really work out as such, but there was a plan initially to dump some of the body parts outside Cornelius Price's, another notorious criminal who was a leading figure in the Maguire faction. Some of the body parts were due to be dumped there, and then others down in Dublin, where Robbie Lawler had been at war with, I suppose, another group of young lads who'd been associating themselves with the Boylans.
And he had a kind of a personal motivation there, because when he wasn't long out of prison that December, and he was basically mugged, or he was kind of confronted by a group of these guys, and he lost these flip-flops and a gym bag. So, the body parts were put into a Puma sports bag, and flip-flops were put in it as well, as if to, send out a message,
because
he'll go far further than they ever would.
Exactly, because they'd recorded it, they'd recorded them confronting him, and then they'd put it up on TikTok or wherever, and it had been a kind of a public humiliation, and that was something that he simply couldn't tolerate. So Stephen Carberry, at this point, he's lost his brother a few months ago, presumably very upset and devastated at that, and he becomes involved in this plot. Stephen Carberry, of course, is somebody who's no stranger to the criminal underworld, and is now serving a sentence for drug dealing offences.
Yeah, that was an interesting enough one. Like it goes back actually to May 2013, but it didn't actually come to trial for 10 years. So it was, and through no fault of his own. I think COVID got in the way, and there was other delays before that. And he was actually under surveillance, and they watched him as he travelled in his BMW, and he went to a particular address in North Dublin in Donabate. And then when he stopped near Glasnevin, they arrested him again. And back at the property, they found 28 kilos of cannabis and 96,000 ecstasy tablets, which between them was just under 1.5 million worth of drugs. So it was quite an amount. He was charged in 2014 and spent a year in custody. And again, like at his sentence hearing, it was mentioned that he had suffered a breakdown on the first anniversary of his brother's murder, and he got, like, including time served, I think it was about a 6.5 year sentence. So he's still in prison at the minute, and he's facing sentence now for the most recent charges that he's pleaded guilty to in assisting an offender with the movement and disposal of body parts of Mulready-Woods. Yeah. So I think that's going to be in January, along with another man who was last week, Glenn Bride from Kilbarrack in Dublin. He also pleaded guilty to a similar charge as well. And they would have been, like they were charged, I think it was in 2024. It was relatively recently when those charges were brought, whereas some of the other men that were involved were charged much earlier on, like back in 2002. So you have the likes of, say, Paul Crosby, who was a key figure in the gang, that were facing the Maguires. Like, he was quite a violent character, involved in a number of incidents. And then you had the householder, Jed McKenna, who was pretty much kind of forced to hand over his house, where they believe Lawler killed Mulready-Woods. It was where he was last seen going in there. And then there was Jared Cruz, who was with Paul Crosby on the day when they brought him to it. So the chances are there's going to be more people brought to justice in the meantime. Obviously, the chief suspect, Robbie Lawler, has escaped justice, having been killed himself in Belfast. When was that? In April 2020. So it was literally within a couple of months. So it's in a very tight timeline from Richie Carberry's death to Robbie Lawler's death. It's a relatively short space of time.
I mean, it was obviously at the very most tense part of that feud. Robbie Lawler had been, while this feud is going on, he was continuing to be involved in basically enforcement of drug debts, where he was, travelling to different parts of the country, interacting with other criminals, such as people like Jared Dundon, because this is the whole other ecosystem of the underworld, where debts are built up and they have to be collected if they're not paid up straight away. And Robbie Lawler was sort of at least operating in part as a kind of a freelance debt collector, and he had travelled up to the north to become, to seek a meeting with a guy that he alleged owed him money. And while he was visiting a house in Belfast, he was shot dead on a Saturday afternoon in broad daylight. And what I suppose is unravelled about that is that it's a very complex setup, but that Gardaí suspect, and the PSNI also suspect, the man behind it is a guy called Mr. Big, who again would be well known to people here. But Mr. Big was at war with Robbie Lawler and at least had ties with the Maguire people within the Maguire faction. So Robbie Lawler, we have these cases are playing out. Stephen Carberry, they help moving these body parts, but Glenn Bryan and Stephen Carberry would have obviously been associates of Robbie Lawler, and the guards would not have suspected them of being involved in killing Keane Mulready-Woods, in chopping up his body, but they became involved at a later point in the movement of his body parts. Obviously, some of his body parts were found across 2 counties.
Yeah, I mean, it was the sports bag was dumped in Moatview and Coolock. That was literally the next day that they were found. And then other body parts were found in a burning car in Ballybock. And I think it was the following year in March when the rest of the remains, the torso of his body, of the teenager's body, was found in Rathmullen Park, which wouldn't really have been far from where he was killed. And that's in Drogheda. And he was actually, his funeral was in April of 2020, and so he would have been buried without all of his remains being found at that stage. So it's an added, I suppose, an added level of pain for the family to have gone through, knowing what had happened to him in the first place. But even then, when they kind of weren't necessarily going to be sure would they be fully laid to rest, I suppose, it was always must have been a worry for them.
Yeah, it's horrific, you see, because we see, certainly if you look at the cases of the disappeared in the north, the people whose bodies were never recovered during the Troubles, and it happens across all sorts of, across Ireland, really, people that while getting some of these remains back and giving them a burial, obviously it doesn't ease people's, or doesn't solve people's grief, but still having unfound body parts is certainly a terrible burden to the family. Now, the murder of Keane Mulready-Woods, Paul Crosby, I think, is serving a 10-year sentence. Again, it was under basically a conspiracy charge as for his role in that. But we do know that Keane Mulready-Woods was basically lured back to a house in Drogheda. And what happened in the room, probably we'll never fully know, but we do know that he lost his life and that his remains were chopped up at that point, and that house was ultimately cleaned up. And
the thing about Crosby, he was a close associate of Robbie Lawler, and he was originally charged with murder.
Yeah.
And he would have met Mulready-Woods, who arrived to some place in Drogheda in a taxi. And it was Paul Crosby who paid the taxi, and then with Gerard Cruz drove to the house in Rathmullen Park. And there was evidence given in I think his sentencing case that there was CCTV that kind of showed the arrival of the teenager with those 2 men, and that he met 3 other men, one of whom was identified as Robbie Lawler. And that this is around 6:25, not around. It was given in evidence in court at 6:25 that they were seen, that Cruz and Crosby were seen walking to their homes, having left the area after that. So the last sighting of Keane Mulready-Woods was about at 10:07 at the back of this house in the company of 3 others. One of those, they believe, was Robbie Lawler, and that he was murdered pretty soon after that time. And it's kind of, there's no evidence whatsoever to suggest that Cruz or Crosby were in the house, but their mobile phones were found in there. And then there was also mobile phone contact between Crosby and Lawler later, shortly afterwards, like 6:45 and 7 o'clock. And Lawler went off he went to Dublin in the immediate aftermath of the murder. So there was all this kind of, it was enough to link Crosby to having played a role. And I suppose the same CCTV kind of gives an inkling as well of what happened. That it was about 8:30. This Volvo car was seen entering a car park near the murder scene, and a man is then seen leaving it and walking towards the house. And he comes back 20 minutes later with 2 large bags and heads southbound towards Dublin. So we kind of, and this is the house that Jed McKenna had been living in, and he was pretty much ordered by Lawler to hand it over. Didn't know what was going to happen. He had no idea what was going to happen, and then he only realised what had happened when he came back and was basically ordered to do a cleanup, and that was done pretty crudely. The guards were able to find quite a lot of evidence of what happened there. There'd been an attempt to wash it. There was one of the guards described, this strong smell of fresh paint, and that part of the floor had been removed. Like, this is all an effort to try and, I suppose, hide the forensics. And he pleaded guilty to impeding a guard investigation, and he got a 4-year sentence for his role, I suppose, in cleaning up the scene, the aftermath.
Certainly the lesser role of all of them. Now you can see we have the number of gangland murders occurring in this country has dramatically dropped, and the rate of detection, the rate of these being solved has dramatically increased as well. And I suppose this case shows in part why that happens, because while it can take a bit of time, the ability to harvest CCTV evidence, I think the Robbie Lawler, he's captured in some of this, but it's some people, it's from shop CCTV, these sort of things. The guards can put together a really good picture. The mobile phone evidence as well, connecting people has become a hugely important thing. And then obviously the forensics you see in this case as well. It has become a lot harder to get away with murder, hasn't it? And also, of course, as well, some of these guys in a previous time, somebody who maybe had driven somebody somewhere or had maybe could be shown to have interacted with a killer, they wouldn't get charged because there wouldn't be enough chain of evidence. But the anti-gangland laws allowed the guards to connect a couple of events, and people are pleading guilty. Getting away with murder has never been more difficult for gangland criminals.
Yeah, and I suppose, and for the likes of Paul Crosby, there's the additional worry, I suppose, from his point of view, that he was one of the targets of Operation Stratus, which was set up to combat the gangs. And he like in April 2020, the same month that Robbie Lawler was killed, he was caught burning out a stolen car, because he was actually under surveillance at the time.
Yeah, and
it was kind of in mysterious circumstance that I wasn't really sure why that was about. So he's been in prison since then. So it's been effective, I suppose, in one sense, in keeping the gang under control. That the Boylan brothers, have fled the country. Crosby's in jail. Lawler is dead. So I mean, in a sense, they've kind of lost the edge in that regard. But yeah, when you look at, I suppose, the crude attempt to clean up the murder scene, and the fact that the child's mother, Mulready-Woods' mother, reported him missing, almost immediately, and then on top of that, the guards got information within a very short space of time that the teenager had been killed as well. So they knew straight away what they were looking for.
Yeah.
So obviously anything that was of interest or potentially of interest was being gathered up by the guards at that stage. And you did have this kind of, I suppose, a task force that were already, they were already there in Drogheda. It wasn't like they were kind of gearing up to, starting from scratch. This is something, it was very much an active operation at the time. So I suppose it kind of shows you another level of the madness and recklessness that Robbie Lawler thought he could get away, with such a gruesome murder in the middle of a town, where this feud has been going on, and where there's been, already been deaths at that stage, and somehow thinks he's going to walk away from it, and involving so many different people.
Yeah.
And so many kind of, people who had, minor roles who certainly aren't going to take the rap for someone like Robbie Lawler if they can help it.
Yeah.
And I suppose it was easier. The fact he was dead, he's not going to get revenge on them now.
No.
But it was a crazy in that sense, in terms of there was no effort really, I suppose, to hide what he'd done. And that I suppose speaks to the fact that he wanted to send a message. No point in killing someone as a message if no one knows you did it.
No, but it does show that the reason some of these people are so dangerous is that they get to a point in their criminal activities that they probably are not even considering, any long-term future. Yeah. That is why they're so dangerous.
And you even would say with Crosby, because as well as the physical war that was going on, there was this sort of parallel war that was going on social media. You referred to it earlier about the videos, and he had sent or he put out a video, mocking Owen Maguire, who'd been shot by Robbie Lawler and left paralysed, saying we'll go for a walk and talk about it and sort things out. So he was mocking him, that kind of, I suppose, that call out type video things. Yeah. So again, there's no sense of trying to hide your involvement in this criminal activity. That you're wearing your badge. It's a badge of pride to say that you're part of the Boylan organised crime gang, or you're part of the Maguire faction, or you're one of Cornelia Price's kind of loyal followers. There was no sense of trying to hide who they were.
No. And of course, then Cornelius Price toasting the death of Robbie Lawler with I think it was cider, was it?
That's right, yeah. It was a little shot glass, whatever it was. Sorry,
it was whiskey. Sorry, whiskey.
And of course, I suppose, karma came back to bite him. He died from a brain infection after several months in a coma in a hospital in Wales, I think, wasn't it?
It was. So, look, a very sad story, and you can never lose sight of the fact that what you're talking about is a child, a legal child being.
Yeah, and that's it's I suppose it really highlighted the case how teenagers are sometimes sucked in. Even though he was seen as being aligned with the Maguire faction, here he was going off quite happily with members of the Boylan gang. And I think it was reported in some places that he may have been recruited by them to act as a courier. And this idea of sucking children in to this kind of business, we saw it recently in some of the evidence about Jamie Gagan in West Dublin using drug, couriers, young fellas as young as 15 getting involved in the drugs trade. And you had Mulready-Woods. I suppose there would have been some information came out at the time that he himself had been involved in, gang activity, and he was under curfew after being connected to a petrol bomb attack on a person's house, and it was all part of debt enforcement. But at the same time, you can't lose sight that he was a child, and it was something that the chief superintendent at the time, Christy Mangan, said. He was reminding people that, look, you're talking about a teenager, someone who's a child, and he just one of the things he said was, this is a brutal and savage attack on a child, and it's completely unacceptable in any normal democratic society. He said it was important to remember that Keane was a child, a young boy, trying to find his way in life, and now he's lost his life, and the family have lost a loved one and their son. And I suppose, and those those feelings would have been aired as well by Elizabeth Wood, when she gave a victim impact statement after Paul Crosby had been convicted and before he got his 10-year sentence, and she talked about it. It's hard to lose a child in such an inhuman, violent, and barbaric death like this. Is totally shocking. And he says you don't get over it, you don't get on. She described it as one of the most brutal and traumatic murders in the history of Ireland, and to be honest, she's probably not wrong there.
No, she definitely isn't. But look, we'll come back to this story when Stephen Carberry is sentenced and see if he has some mitigation in relation to his own actions. So thanks, Eamon.
Always a pleasure, Niall.